Morning, everyone. So how has the last week been for you in reference to dealing with changes? Everybody adjust to that? Are we all finished with that? Have we all conquered the fear of change? Have we all embraced change and said, yes, this is what I want in my life? If you have, you are way ahead of me, way ahead of me. Every day is a struggle, from the small things like dealing with allergies to the big things, which I asked the Lord at the beginning of this series to help me with, this little thing called patience. And it's not a sermon series on patience, but I know that that is something that the Lord desperately wants me to change in my life. Not to become less patient, but to become more patient. And that's a major change that I know that the Lord is going to be working on for a long time in my life. So hopefully the Lord has pinpointed something in your life from last week that He is constantly bringing to your mind. I want to say nag, but God doesn't nag us. He just reminds us. So I hope that He's put something in your heart, something in your mind that when you go to Him in prayer, when you have that quiet moment of reflection with just you and Him and nothing else going on, He says, Tim, you need to deal with whatever it might be. Because in this short series that we're doing, we're asking ourselves that question, Lord, in 5 years, what do you want to change about me? What do you want different about me? What areas in my life do you want to see growth? And we saw last week that this is called sanctification. When God saves us, when He brings us into a relationship with Him, He justifies us. He makes us right before Himself because of the work of Jesus on the cross, and we are justified. And then we go through this process where we're still here on earth, where we still have trials and difficulties and pains and temptations, where we still have these moments of great success and these moments of utter failure. And our character is being worked on. It's not until we pass from this life to the next that we reach glorification, where we are made perfect in every way. No, we're not there yet. We're in this process called sanctification, being set apart for God's holy use, and each and every day, He whittles away at our self and replaces it with the glory of Christ. And that change, as we saw last week, is a normal part of the growth process. And He said that we will never stop changing. He's made that promise to us, that we will be like Christ one day. And while we are pilgrims in this foreign land, He is going to impress upon us time and time again through songs, through messages and sermons, through His own word and the influence of His Spirit, that we need to grow and be different in this life. And He's promised He will never stop challenging us to change. Now, we saw that change is that normal part of our growth. It is a normal activity in the Christian life. But that change can be very challenging. Like any change that we face, it can be challenging. And change can be very scary because we can't predict the outcome or the control of things around us. And we might even resist that growth. We might even resist that change. But fear and uncertainty about change in our Christian lives, in our character, is completely conquered once we realize that we can have trust in the God who brings those changes about. So change does not have to be scary for us. Change does not have to be threatening to the status quo. Change can be comforting because we have the assurance that not only is God in control, but that He loves us dearly and wants the best of Christ to reflect our lives. And so we can enter into those times of needing patience. We can enter into those times of needing to control our anger. We can enter those times where we feel we are stingy. We can enter those times when we are selfish and say, Lord, it's okay if you chip away at the old self and replace it with the new creation. Because in the end, it brings me joy to be near to you, and it brings joy to those around us who see Christ reflected in us. So back to the question we asked last week. Where does God want me to change spiritually in the next 5 years? You don't have to get a list of 20 things. If you had a list of one thing and focused on it, I think the Lord would be incredibly pleased with that growth and that change. What is that one thing in your life 5 years from now you know the Lord wants to see different in your life? The maturity, the reflecting of Jesus more and more to the people around us. How would people know that you are a Christian? Mahatma Gandhi, the Prime Minister of India, once said, I like your Christ, but I do not like your Christians. Your Christians are unlike Christ. Take a second. Let that sink in. Now, I don't think Gandhi had a right view of Christ. He was not a believer. But he did notice something that is reflected in this quote. He knows something of the Christ revealed in Scripture. And when he looks at the Christians who claim the name of Christ, he says there's a difference. Why is there that difference? When the world looks at us, it should see a city shining on a hill, a light unhidden, the glory of Christ surrounding them. But all too often, what do they see in a Christian? The big one, they say, is we see hypocrites, right? We see hypocrites. They say one thing and do something else. The church, even Calvary Church, is not perfect. No church here on earth is perfect. There never has been and never will be a perfect Christian to walk this land, to walk this pilgrimage. The church is a place where God's saints are set apart for worship and service. But more or less, I like to think of the church as a hospital for sinners. A place where we get better. A place where we are improved upon. A place in where we are comfortably sanctified for God's good purpose and God's great work. Christ and the Christian should in time look more and more alike. The Christian should reflect Christ more and more. And so when you think about change in 5 years, really the question we need to be asking ourselves is, how should I reflect Christ more in the next 5 years? And maybe the critics of Christianity, when they see that reflection, they will have less charges of hypocrite and more charges of, wow, they look a lot like Christ. I can't think of a better compliment than that. Can you, from the world? Wow, you look a lot like Christ. I still don't like it. I still don't want to heed the message. I still don't want to think about the message. But you are a lot like what I've seen the character of Christ in Scripture. To that end, we're looking at the book of Philippians and Paul's message to the believers on how to encourage that change in us and how to allow that change to come without fear of the uncertainty. Starting in Philippians chapter 2, we see in verse 12, Paul starting this beautiful section. He says, "Therefore, my dear friends, as you have always obeyed, not only in my presence, but now much more in my absence, continue to work out your salvation with fear and trembling." He's talking to this church in Philippi, which was a small church, and he mentions, first of all, this beautiful principle that he loves their obedience. He loves their decision to follow Christ at all costs, not only when Paul's there, but when Paul's gone. Obedience in the absence of an authority figure is part of the Christian life. I know I harp on this all the time, and eventually I'll find some kind of new illustration to bring you, but let's talk about driving, okay? Yesterday, or was it Thursday? Every day just mixes itself up. Driving down the boulevard, Pueblo Boulevard, to go home, I know the speed limit there is 55. And I am actually very aware that it's 55. And I keep it close to 55. Close. But there was an officer, a state patrol officer, that had pulled someone off to the side. And my first response is what? To slow down. Because I saw an authority figure. I was going 55. I was already going the speed limit, but I saw an officer and said, ooh, I better, just in case. See, when there is an authority figure present, sometimes you act differently. Sometimes you respond differently. Sometimes you think differently, but you certainly act differently. Now, I was already going 55, and all of a sudden I see this authority figure, and I go, oh, I start to get concerned. Paul says to the church at Philippi, you Christians, you believers, are an amazing group of believers because I don't have to be there, and I know that you follow God. I know of your obedience. I've heard it, I've seen it, and I've heard it through the grapevines, that even if I'm not there, you love him with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and you love your neighbor as yourself. You exhibit the obedience of a Christian life. Is that true of us? If an authority figure is not present, do we still want to love God and obey him? Or do we act differently if we see someone from church and we're having a fuss? Oh, I got to stop. I got to stop. I can't let them see me like this. I think that's happened to all of us. But Paul says, I admire these believers at this church, Philippi, because I don't have to be there. I don't have to be watching over them. I don't have to be in their presence to know they love Jesus and they love one another. And he also says in there that they continue to work out their salvation with fear and trembling. Our behavior does not give us salvation. That is very important to keep in our mind. Our behavior does not give us or earn us salvation. That's called legalism. That's called work righteousness. The only work that's ever done so that we are saved is the work of Jesus Christ and him alone. We do not add to it. We do not enhance it. We do not earn even 1% of it. That's the work of God in Jesus on the cross. But our salvation should be reflected in how we act, how we behave. It should reflect it. We have to live up to the standard of what we already have attained. And Paul says that in Philippians chapter 3. Only let us live up to what we already have obtained. You've obtained salvation through the mercy and grace of Jesus Christ. You have embraced it, believed it, made it your own, and God has worked change in your life. You are now a person of change. And that should be reflected. Your salvation should always be reflected in your works. That's what James says. Faith without works is dead. It's a dead faith. It's just a talking puppet of hypocrisy that you love but you don't love, or that you forgive but you don't forgive, or that you have your temper under control but you don't. And no wonder the world looks at us and says, hypocrites. Hypocrites. Paul encourages us, we need to work it out. It's a process of where we reflect the work of Jesus Christ more and more each day. We put off the old self and put on the new self that Paul talks about in Corinthians. That is what it means to work out your salvation, to make it evident to the world around us that we are who we say we are. We're a believer. We are who we say we are. He continues in verse 13 of Philippians 2 and says, "For it is God who works in you to will and to act in order to fulfill his good purpose." So he's told us we need to work out this salvation. We need to reflect the work of God in our lives in saving us, and at the same time, it's God's work. At the same time, it is God who works in us to will and to act to fulfill his good purpose. That's our mission statement in life, to fulfill God's good purpose, to live according to his word, and to be true to our relationship with him. It's God's work. So I would counsel someone, I would encourage someone, if they are feeling stressed about changes in their spiritual life, if they are overwhelmed maybe with the changes that God needs to make in your spiritual life, I'm there, I'm overwhelmed, the first thing you need to do is you need to run to God and say, "God, you got to help. You've got to work in me. You've got to reveal to me your mercies, your tenderness, your truth, that I might live according to it, that I might make it my pleasure to seek you day in and day out." If you approach God with a heart that humble and a request that sincere, "Lord, help me become more like Jesus," he is going to work in you miraculous ways. He is not going to let a prayer like that fall by deaf ears. He doesn't let any prayer like that fall by deaf ears, any prayer. But a prayer made of humbleness, "Lord, work in me, work in me, work in me." And you might go, "I don't even know what he needs to work on. There's just too much." That's okay. God knows what to work in us. God knows where we need to reflect Jesus. God knows where we need to be refined. God knows what old self needs to be put off and what new self needs to be put on. He continues in verse 14 in an amazing connection. He talks about change. He talks about sanctification. He talks about this working out our salvation. And then he says in verse 14, "Do everything without grumbling or arguing, so that you may become blameless and pure, children of God without fault in a warped and crooked generation." Paul, why are we talking about grumbling and complaining? Because Paul's talking about change. He's talking about us being more like Christ, and that is hard work. That is work that is selfless work. That is work where I deny myself and I elevate Christ in my life, and you better believe grumbling and complaining is going to come along, because I don't like how it feels. I don't like that change. I have to deny myself, pick up the cross, and follow him. Jesus is asking us in our salvation that we would die to ourselves and live for him. That is hard. And oftentimes, accompanied with things that are hard, we grumble and complain. We grumble and complain because we don't like it. Because it hurts. Because it's humbling. It's humbling to seek forgiveness. It's humbling. It's humbling to do the whole work of the Christian life. Because we admit that we're not the most important person or idea, but God is. God is most important in my life. His ideas are most important. His purposes are most important, not our own. And when we face that head on with change, Paul's right. A lot of times what accompanies that is grumbling and complaining. Do we need any illustrations on that grumbling and complaining? Or we know what we're talking about. We got it down. My dog, every dog I've ever owned, I do not allow at the dinner table. Well, obviously, I don't even allow it to be around the dinner table, not sitting at the dinner table. I don't allow the dog to be around the dinner table. And so the rule is every dog has to be on a carpet, away from the table. All you have to do is look at the dog and say, Rosie, carpet, at that moment of dinner. And she doesn't vocalize grumbling and complaining, but you just know it. And what this dog does, and every dog I've ever had, it puts one paw on the carpet, the back paw, just like this. I'm on the carpet, and in her heart, if she had a soul, she'd be grumbling and complaining. All right? I'm doing it, but I'm not liking it. And so I think that translates to the Christian life, where we'll say, I'll do it, but I don't like it. I'll volunteer, but they're going to have to know that I'm really making a sacrifice to volunteer. I'll give $1 to that cause, but it's only $1. But I'll make sure I let people know that. Grumbling and complaining. If there was anything that every Christian had down pat, it'd be grumbling and complaining about change. And Paul says, do everything without it. Without it. But that's hard. Yes, it's hard. But it's okay. It's okay. Because there's enough for us to have to work on individually that we don't need to share with the rest of the world everybody else's faults. Grumbling and complaining. He continues and says, then, okay, so I'm doing everything without grumbling and complaining. I'm becoming blameless and pure, children of God without fault in a warped and crooked generation. So the world sees something different about us. I'm applying sanctification, change, and growth in my life, and I'm doing it without being frustrated and complaining. And here's the payoff. At the end of verse 15, then you will shine among them like stars in the sky as you hold firmly to the word of life. You will shine like stars. You will be brilliantly visible to the world around you, to this wicked and crooked generation. One of the most, I am so in love with Colorado. I am so in love with Pueblo. I am so in love with Pueblo West that at night you can go outside and I have seen the stellar bands of the Milky Way right there. Not just a couple stars and a moon, but the stellar band of the Milky Way. Do you know how absolutely cool that is? And maybe you have grown up around it for so long that you notice a full moon, but that's just about it. You got to stop. Well, tonight's probably not going to be the night, but every other night of the year, 300 other days out of the year, take a moment and just get into that darkness of the night and look up at the stars. I don't have any of them memorized. I know where the Big Dipper is, and that's about it. But I am fascinated at looking at them. They are just marvelous that God has put these tiny little lights in the sky, and I get to experience it. It's beautiful. And I think Paul is making a similar connection here. When you notice that night sky and it is brilliant and you just stop for a moment and every thought leaves and you are just thinking about how big and awesome God is, that is how the world, when it sees the Christian interacting with them, they should be just as shocked and amazed. They should be going, wow, I knew them a long time ago. Went to grade school with them. I knew how they talked. I knew how they acted. What happened? Why are you so different? Why have you changed? There is not an easier opportunity to witness to the gospel when someone says, what's different about you? You didn't lose weight. Your hair's falling out. But what's different about you? Well, God has grabbed a hold of me in a way that scared me at first, because he asked me to surrender my life to him. And in return, he has given me every joy and blessing under heaven as my promise and surety that one day I will be with him. Do you want that too? There's not an easier gospel presentation than when someone asks you, what makes you different? Why don't you listen to the bad jokes? Why don't you swear? Why don't you drink to an excess with us? Why? You're still with your spouse after 30 years? What? Those little things can have a huge impact on the world around us. But to start that impact, we have to say, Lord, change me. Change me into that brilliant, shining light that reflects the glory of Jesus Christ. Not a better me. I don't want a better me. I know me. I don't need a better me. I need Jesus living in me for the world to see. I need them to see Jesus, not a better Tim. You see, Christianity, at its core, is not about making sure you get to heaven. I used to have an opening line when I went street witnessing. I used to ask people if they had fire insurance. Do you have fire insurance? And the reply would often be, what? And I said, fire insurance, you know, against the pains and suffering of hell. See, I was so concerned about making them go to heaven, I never thought, you know what, do I need to tell them also that saying yes to Christ is saying no to self? It's saying yes to a life that's ridiculed by the world? Saying yes to Christ is saying yes to picking up a cross and following him? See, I don't want to share those tough things. I just wanted to get them to heaven. But Christianity is so much more than just making it to heaven. It is living in this very moment with a full and uncompromised commitment to all things Jesus. All things Jesus. It is taking my life and replacing it with Christ. His thoughts, his truth, his feelings, his actions need to become mine. The world will notice the difference between that person who professes, yeah, I go to church on Sundays, and that person who lives out their faith day in and day out. They're not going to see perfection. We're not perfect. But they're going to see how you deal with things. Have you ever had a boss? Oh, I had a boss one time. This was in seminary, and so I was just looking for a job just to earn money, and wasn't a career, but I had a boss who was absolutely clueless. How he ever became the boss there, I have no idea, no idea. But he would have us do the most insane things, like stack boxes and boxes of paper in the boiler room. Are you aware that that's generally not a normal, common, safe practice for businesses? To stack papers, boxes and boxes of papers right next to the boiler. He had us do that. The fire marshal came in, did inspections, and said, you know, you can't do this. And I remember telling this guy, you know, I don't think we should be doing this, and I did it anyway. And he had me, I was the one that had to stack up all the papers. Well, 3 months later, the fire marshal comes in and says, you can't do this. And I was told, well, you know, you really shouldn't stack papers there, Tim. Like, oh, wow, never knew that. Thank you very much. That's great advice. So he had me remove all the papers because I had we're talking 30, 40 boxes filled with paper next to the boiler. But I didn't say a word. I could have reamed him out in front of the fire marshal. I could have told his boss that it was his idea. Instead, I just moved the paper, moved it back to where it needed to be. I don't say that because I have a lot more examples where I do grumble and complain, but there's an example where I didn't. And he came to me later and said, I don't know why you didn't get upset with me. I said, I was upset. I was disappointed that you didn't listen to me at the beginning. But I realized that this wasn't a big deal. I'll just move paper, and I'll get paid for it, both times, there and back. And we were able to have a real conversation about what it's like to be a Christian. And we've had that conversation. I had that with him for a year or so when I was working with him, and he kept going back to, well, I remember when you didn't complain. Something that silly and small made such an impression on him and others that I had an opportunity to share my faith every day there. Because I kept my mouth quiet, didn't complain, didn't argue, didn't fuss, didn't throw them under the bus. My testimony was clean and receptive with them. But even in that, we have to remember that our behavior does not give us salvation, but it should reflect our salvation. See, we're talking about behavioral changes. We're talking about improvements in our character. We cannot confuse that with, therefore, God gives us salvation because we're doing so good at changing. Those are two separate categories. Salvation is given to us by justification. Changes happen through salvation and with salvation that make us more holy, that make us reflect Jesus Christ more and more. Paul concludes that section in Philippians and says, in that ending of that verse, and then you will be able to boast. Then you will be able to boast on that day of Christ that I did not run or labor in vain. See, Paul says it's all going to be worth it. In the end, if you put change and growth and character in front of you as, Lord, change me, because in time you're going to realize that it wasn't in vain, that it was a good race, that it was a good pilgrimage and journey. Because you're going to realize that as you reflect Jesus more, you have joy. You have peace. You have contentment. You don't worry. You don't stress out about life and finances and health and jobs. Because you have Christ living in you. And you are so tightly connected to that growth and that change and that dependence upon God that you are overwhelmed with a sense of security. To have that sense of security day in and day out, it's a prize. And Paul says, this labor, this change, this growth, it's not for nothing. There's great value in it. Great value in it. To take home, I want to leave you with one thing. And this may seem counterintuitive at the first, but think about it. We need to stop trying to act like Christians. Because anyone can put on an act. Anyone can act a certain way. It's acting God doesn't want. Acting is not what defines us as Christians. But instead, we need to become more like Christ in his thinking with truth, feeling with his compassion, and his complete and utter dependence upon God to lead and guide him. Trust him. If we were able to make those kind of improvements in our character, I want to think like Christ, I want to feel like Christ, and I want to depend on the Father like Christ did, I cannot believe the amount of change that would happen in us. For the good, for His glory, for the world to see as bright and shining lights of the gospel, as encouragements to evangelism and change. If we thought like Christ, had compassion like Christ, and depended upon the Father like Christ did. Those are 3 big asks. 3. To think like Christ, to feel like Christ, and to trust like Christ. If we want to be more Christ-like, this is where it starts. If you want to know a game plan for the next 5 years, is to think like Christ, to feel like Christ, and to trust like Christ. Those are not small things. Those are challenging. Is the challenge worth it? Paul would say, absolutely. It's not in vain. It's not worthless. It's what defines us as God's children to the world. Let's pray. Father, I think we would all admit and confess that there are a lot of times in our life where we put on an act. Where we put on an act that we're good, that we put on an act that we're fine, that we put on an act that we're more spiritual than what we really are. Forgive us, Father, for lying. And help us, Lord, to think more like Christ, to be compassionate and feeling and loving like Him, and to be wholly and completely dependent upon Christ. Father, don't let us live for ourselves. Let us live for You. That our labor may not be in vain, that our striving and changes would not be just simply habits, but it be character changes. Lord, help us in the next week, in the very next day, to reflect Jesus to the world around us in a meaningful way, in a way that helps us spread the gospel message of Your love and of Your forgiveness. We know, Lord, that it's scary, it's not easy, and we're so natural at grumbling and complaining. But Lord, break us of that and mold us into Christ. In His name, all of God's people said, Amen. You are dismissed for the day.